Hello everybody, Jade Hamilton here again. And as promised, I am back to read to you more of the Revolting Bridesmaid. I've still got little Cariad with me in her gorgeous outfit, and she's been ready to listen to a story for ages, hasn't you, Poppet? She was like, Mummy, hurry up and film so that I can listen to my story. So we're now filming. As per all videos where I read, all copyright for The Revolting Bridesmaid goes to Mary Hooper and to Bloomsbury. I own absolutely nothing. Make yourself comfortable. Grab yourself a hot drink if you've got one. And we will begin. We're now on chapter 5, I believe. Let's see. Right. Sorry about that, guys. It was a few days later, chapter 5, sorry. It was a few days later when Helen pushed me through the front door and prodded me all the way down the hall into the kitchen where Mum was peeling potatoes. I've never been so humiliated in my life, she said dramatically. Never! She put down the bag she was carrying on the kitchen table and flopped into a chair. It's been a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. Mum looked directly at me with an exasperated expression. Whatever's she done now? She said. Why do you look straight at me? I said indignantly. How do you know I've got something to do with it? Sixth sense, Mum said, just as Helen burst out with another chorus of dreadful. I'll never get over the embarrassment. So humiliating, I just can't tell you. Following which she managed to tell us without drawing breath. Following which she managed to tell us without drawing breath, we met Mrs. Bailey in country casuals and tweeds as arranged. She turned, and as she spoke, I slid sideways towards the door. I noticed a typed letter addressed to me on the hall table, and I was desperate to get to it. Get back here, Helen said. I want you to hear what Mum's got to say about all this. There's a letter for me, I mumbled. Here, Helen said, just as if I was a dog. I sat down at the table and waited for the storm to break over me. As I said, Helen started again, we met Mrs. Bailey and she took us along to the bride's bouquet. I don't know why it's called the bride's bouquet, I interrupted, playing for time. It's a silly name, isn't it, Mum? It's not a bunch of flowers. Why do they call it the bride's boudoir or the bride's... Why don't you just shut up? Why don't you shut up? Helen said fiercely. All the bride's business? I said quietly. We started looking through wedding dresses. I quite like the look of ivory, but Mrs. Bailey said very pale pink was fashionable this year. Or bride's boutique, I said in a whisper. Well, I hadn't actually tried anything on. I still couldn't decide on shade, and we were about to move on to bridesmaids' dresses to keep her ear amused when I looked round and she'd got for but when I looked round for her, she'd gone, disappeared. Mum tutted. She's always wandering off. Fancy disappearing when you're supposed to be looking at bridesmaids' dresses, though, Katie. Oh, she hadn't disappeared, Helen said, heavily and sarcastically. I wouldn't have minded if she'd disappeared. I would have quite liked that. Oh, no. What she'd done was picked up some awful macho yob and tried to get us together. What? Mum asked faintly. It's perfectly true, I promise you, Helen said. I've never been so humiliated in my life. Never. There I was, actually choosing my wedding dress, and I turned round, and there she was, with some awful lout in tow, saying, Helen, someone wants to meet you. I don't know what Mrs. Bailey must think of us. I really don't. I could just die of humiliation every time I think of it. I tried to make myself invisible by leaning back hard against the wall, but I don't think it worked. Two pairs of eyes bored into me accusingly. Katie, Mum said, how could you? I was just trying to be helpful, I said. Just trying to give Helen the opportunity of meeting other men before it's too late. Besides, of meeting other men before it's too late, I was trying to save the divorce rate. Besides, Mrs. Bailey didn't even notice. She was too busy flaunting herself round the department and bossing people about. They carried on, staring at me. Anguish and horror written all over their faces. He was dead cool, I blustered, like he was in a boy band or something. He was the sort of person a girl wouldn't mind having for a brother-in-law. He was dreadful, Helen said faintly. He was wearing a disgusting-looking hoodie and jeans that hung down so far they showed his pants. He had a piercing through his eyebrow, for goodness sake. And apart from anything else, he was about 10 years younger than me. That's because you're used to old men, I said. He had a really cool pair of trainers. Katie, Mum said again. And it seemed to me that people were saying my name like that all the time lately, in an anguished voice with an exclamation mark at the end. I felt Mum and Helen exchange head shakes and eye rollings while I pretended an intense interest in the pattern of the tablecloth. Katie, haven't you always been told never to talk to strangers? Didn't see any harm in it, I muttered. He was just hanging about outside the bride's, was it? Probably a shoplifter, Helen said. And he looked really nice, so I said, would he like to come in with me and meet my sister, okay? So you didn't want to meet him, but I wasn't to know that, was I? I just thought you might like to meet someone really interesting and cool instead of a Katie, Mum said warningly. That's quite enough. I think you better go upstairs now and just think about what you've done. Right, I said, moving to the door in a trice. Do you know, I've a good mind not to let her be a bridesmaid, Helen said. But before I could get too excited, she added, if it wasn't for having you to match Felicity, I'd just do without you. As I went down the hall, I heard them falling on the bag of bits and pieces Helen had bought and exclaiming over them excitedly. So much for Helen's total and utter humiliation, which would stay with her forever. I snatched up my letter from the table and ran upstairs with it. Okay, so one of my plans had fallen through, but this letter could be the answer to everything. Dear Katie Wilson, thank you for your letter, but we are sorry to have to tell you that the new series of Dateline Maid has already been filmed, and we will not be needing any more contestants for another year. Perhaps we should know that you should also know that we receive hundreds of applications from people who actually want to take part, so never have to resort to using people who have been nominated for the show by their relatives. We hope your sister will be very happy in her forthcoming marriage and that you have a lovely day. Yours sincerely, Researcher. I crumpled the letter up into a little ball and threw it away. What a waste of a stamp! I would have to think of something else. Chapter 6. I picked at the balls of fluff that for some reason had congregated along the sleeve of my tracksuit and stared moodily out of my bedroom window. I was fed up. I was getting nowhere with the campaign, and every day the wedding was coming closer. I bet it's getting really exciting at isn't it? Daisy had said that morning. Oh, yes, I'd said gloomily. Really exciting. Are they having a present display? She asked. My sister had a big table in the spare room, and after the wedding, all the guests walked by it and admired what they'd bought. Dunno, I said. I think it's a cheek anyway. Fancy sending out lists of things they want. That's so they don't get 6 toasters, she said wisely. But there are some people who don't ask for the list as it goes wrong, so it goes wrong anyway. My sister still got 5 toasters, she added. I'm going to make a list next birthday and send it out, I said. See how people like that. Has your sister got the dress yet? Has your sister got the dress yet? Daisy asked in a hushed and excited voice. Dunno, I said again. No one tells me anything, and I'm not even allowed to go shopping with them now. Something as big as an elephant arrived and wrapped in a big sheet the other day. I suppose that was it. And what about your dress? Whisper blue with taffeta overskirt, exquisite beaded bodice and puff sleeves. I reeled off automatically. It's being let out, and I've got another fitting for it next week. The darling little circlet of flowers are being made fresh on the day, I added, then made a face which meant I was likely to be sick. Daisy went into fresh squeals of excitement at this, and I gave her a withering look to get her to shut up. I soon made it up with her, though. I find I often do when people have got a lot of chocolate in their pockets. If only that man, worked for a chocolate firm, or was anything, in fact, except a teacher. The previous evening he'd wanted to sit down with me in the school holidays, mind, and go all over I remembered about dividing sentences into their correct grammatical parts. I said I couldn't remember anything, upon which he got so concerned and upset that I thought he was going to cry. He said I really ought to be up on them before next year, so how about sitting down for half an hour so he could help me? It was then that I decided it was time for an early night. I sighed, finished picking at my sleeve, and then sat down and thumbed through one of Mum's magazines. I came to the problem page and thought about writing it to it for advice on getting rid of that man. But then a bit further on, I found an advertisement for a firm by a firm called Superdate, which sounded just what I was looking for. Someone for everyone. No one should settle for second best when they could meet the person of their dreams. Girls, meet Prince Charming. Boys, meet Cinderella. Yes, you too could be the happiest person in the world when you meet that super date personally handpicked and supplied by us. Money back guarantee. Golden opportunity of a lifetime. Put a lot of cuddles in your life. No one should settle for second best, I thought, filling in the form with Helen's details and naturally exaggerating her characteristics to give her more of a chance. For ginger hair, I put gorgeous auburn, and when it said give yourself an attraction rating out of 1 to 10, I put 20 with a load of exclamation marks behind it. The thing was, when I got down to the end of the form, it said in very small print, give us your credit card number and we will debit your account for £50. I crumpled up the form. I didn't have a credit card and I didn't think Helen would let me use hers, especially if she knew what I wanted it for. As I was crumpling, I had a brilliant idea though. All that the Super Date place was doing really was advertising people. So why couldn't I do that myself and save money? Why not, in other words, put up my own advert for Helen on the local newsagent's notice board with the cars and flats and second-hand sofas? Okay, so it wouldn't reach as big a market as Super Date, but finding someone who lived locally would be so much more convenient. I carefully wrote a few of Helen's vital statistics on a postcard. There wasn't a lot of room, so I just put something about a gorgeous redhead seeking a new friend and took the card down to the shop on the corner. I felt extremely pleased with myself as I walked home. I'd more or less done the same thing as Super Date, but I'd say £49.75p. It would be quite interesting too. They could phone up. I could interview them and then invite them round to meet Helen. She didn't know where they'd come from. I'd just line up all the best ones on the settee, ready for her inspection. I still felt extremely pleased with myself at tea time, but at about 5:30, when I answered the phone and someone just breathed down it, I started to have second and then third thoughts. Huff, huff, huff. Someone said breathily. Then I listened, panicked, slammed the phone down, and rushed to the newsagent to get the notice taken out of the window. Not one of my better ideas. I'd obviously have to think of something else. Chapter 7. Do try and stand still, dear? Mrs. Bailey said, giving one of her royal family smiles and displaying a great swathe of gold fillings. Katie, for goodness sake, stop wriggling, Mum snapped. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bailey, she's not usually such a pain. We were in Bliss's bridal bouquet fitting room, where I'd been forced into my whisper blue dress with taffeta overskirt, exquisite beaded bodice, and puff sleeves. There's things sticking in me, I complained, frowning down at the alterations lady who was deliberately making me suffer. And a bit of exquisite beading has come off and fallen down my neck. Mum sighed. The lady's nearly finished, Katie. Just stand still and be patient for a little while longer. After what seemed like about 6 hours, the alteration lady stood up and said she was almost satisfied. I'm just going to let the bodice out the tiniest bit more, she said. Other than that, our young lady looks perfect. I glowered at myself in the mirror. I didn't look at all perfect to me, more like a dog's dinner. From the neck down, I was a froth of whisper blue, but out of this stuck an indignant-looking face, topped by stubbly hair sticking out all over the place. I looked like part of one of those card games where you fit different heads on bodies and make strange combinations. A vision of loveliness, Mrs. Bailey pronounced. Almost, that is. We've just got to do something about the hair. Yes, you look lovely, darling, Mum said uncertainly. Very, different. Can I take it off now? I asked plaintively. But they started a conversation about veils. Should or shouldn't Helen have one over her face as she went into the church, and had forgotten about me, so I took the dress off anyway and climbed back into my tracksuit and trainers. We went into the shoe section next door to collect my satin ballet shoes, but which had not only been dyed to match, but also had some exquisite beading on them. I couldn't see why, because the dress would cover them up. But still, what Mrs. Bailey wanted, Mrs. Bailey got. What she didn't know about well-dressed weddings wasn't worth knowing. While we were waiting for the shoes to be wrapped in tissue, Mrs. Bailey got out some photographs of Felicity, whose dress was being fitted at the Bliss's store near where she lived. I thought it would be nice for you to see what little Felicity is like. Mrs. Bailey said she's a little slimmer than you. She looked thoughtfully at my midriff, inflated lately by Daisy's chocolate pieces. But do you know she's exactly the same height as you? Isn't that lucky? While Mum marvelled over this amazing piece of good luck, I looked at the photographs and groaned quietly to myself. She was just how I'd expected her to be, thin and pale and blonde, with luxuriant hair that hung down to her shoulders in perfect curls. She also had a simpering, goody-goody expression on her face. You can imagine how the flower circlet will look on that hair, Mrs. Bailey said with a soft smile. I didn't trust myself to speak. I felt positively ill at the thought of the wedding day, where I'd be stuck with this simpering blonde thing. Of course, she'd be the absolutely perfect bridesmaid, and forever after I'd be compared to her and found lacking in all the bridesmaidly qualities. Wasn't Felicity a perfect bridesmaid, they'd say. Wasn't Felicity the most wonderful bridesmaid the world had ever seen? All the more reason for getting rid of that man. Get rid of him, and Felicity would go too. We collected the shoes, and Mrs. Bailey escorted us out to the store exit. Now, my dear, everything's in order, isn't it? She said to Mum. She ticked things off on her fingers. The wedding dress has arrived, the headdress, the shoes, the veil. She bent over Mum and kissed the air at the side of her cheek. It's such a relief. I'm so pleased my son is marrying your Helen, she gushed, which immediately gave me a brilliant idea. Instead of trying to turn Helen off him, why didn't I try a completely new angle and try to turn him off her? Anything was worth a try to prevent me being the laughingstock of the entire school. I thought about it all the way home and started as soon as we got in. Helen and that man were installed in the kitchen having coffee, and he immediately proved what a crawler he was by immediately jumping up, giving Mum his seat, and pouring her out a coffee from the jug. Helen moved towards me to take my bag and see what we'd bought, and I flinched away from her nervously. Oh, hang on. I flinched away from her nervously. No, don't hit me, I said in a wonderful... Don't hit me again. She looked at me and astonished. Why on earth would I hit you? What have you done? I managed a very authentic looking shiver. I haven't always had to have done anything for you to hit me, do I? That man looked round in astonishment, and Helen, taken aback, goggled at me. What on earth are you talking about? You know, I said darkly, and I moved very stealthily round the kitchen to get some orange out of the fridge, pressing myself against the walls and trying to keep out of her reach. Don't be so silly, Katie, Mum said briskly. What do you think you're up to now? You might not know everything that goes on in this house, I said mysteriously, looking at Helen as if she might spring at me at any moment. Mum shook her head slowly and thoughtfully. I sometimes wonder about you, Katie, I really do, she said in a resigned voice. Perhaps it's too much television or something. Can I go to my room? I asked in a terrified whisper. Yes, for goodness sake, do, I said. And I slunk out of the room and ran upstairs. That would make him have second thoughts, all right. Chapter 8. It didn't, though. I managed a couple of days of slinking around the house like an injured dog and giving plaintive whimpers whenever Helen came near me, but no one took any notice. In fact, in the end, they started treating it as a big joke and had a good laugh about it. So I abandoned the plan and started thinking about others. It was all getting a bit close, though. Presents had started arriving. Presents in lovely big colourful boxes with silver ribbons and bows. I felt quite sick with jealousy until they were opened and I saw the sort of things that were inside. boring things like steam irons, wine glasses, matching his and hers bathrobes, pillowcases, and enough tea towels for each day of the year. No toasters so far. Oh, one afternoon, Mum sent me up to Helen's bedroom to leave some brochures for a car hire company on her desk. Hang on a minute, let me pause for one. I'm so sorry, gang. That was the stork delivering our newest cubby. I'm so sorry about that. But I had to go and answer the door. Now, where were we? Hang on. Right. One afternoon, Mum sent me up to Helen's bedroom to leave some brochures for a car hire company on her desk. I put them down and then I sat on her bed, looking round and round, thinking deeply. Above the desk were two pinboards, stuck all over with old photographs, pre-that man photographs, and I crossed to have a look at them. They were mostly holiday snaps. Helen and me in Cornwall, Helen building a sandcastle for me at Brighton, Helen taking me on the ghost train at Blackpool. One really interested me though. Helen and a holiday romance of hers in Newquay. I thought back. It had been 3 years ago when I'd been about 7. He, the holiday romance, had been staying at the same boarding house as us, and I hadn't really noticed him until suddenly Helen wasn't available to look after me or take me to the amusement park. Helen was only to be seen walking off into a distance with her arms around, I thought hard, Michael or Mick or Mark. That was his name. There were several photographs of him, and he'd been really quite reasonable. Now I looked at him closely. Certainly better than a tiresome teacher in peculiar trousers. What happened to him, though? As far as I could remember, she hadn't seen him any more after the holiday, but I could only vaguely remember her mooning about the house, waiting for letters, looking out of the window for the postman, and sighing a lot. I could also remember being sent out of the room so she could have earnest discussions with Mum. Great! I sprang back from the pinboard onto the bed and then did a forward flip from it. It wasn't too late. Memories of the holiday romance could be revived, and Helen, when she thought about Mark again and all the good times they'd had, would suddenly realise that he'd been the real thing, and that man was completely wrong for her. I somersaulted back to my own room. There wasn't time for Helen, in other words me, to write to Mark, having suddenly discovered that she still loved him, and she wouldn't be fooled for a minute if I made up a letter and pretended it had come from him. No, it had to be cleverer than that, cleverer and quicker. I stared out of the window into the front garden, waiting for inspiration to strike, and it did, almost immediately. Flowers! Of course, the very thing. Flowers from Mark to Helen, with all his love, saying he'd never forgotten the holiday and was still pining for her. Perhaps then there could be a P.S. saying he was sorry he hadn't written, but his arm had been broken until quite recently. Okay, I reasoned, thinking of possible objections to this story. It seemed far-fetched, but what if it had been a particularly bad break in both arms? And they'd been set wrongly and had to be re-broken several times and started again. I wandered down to the garden and studied the flowers. Dad and Mum had been gardening, so there wasn't much. Half a dozen dahlias and some dead-looking daisies that smelled awful. Helen obviously wasn't going to get swept off her feet and cancel the wedding because of those. No, if I was going to do it, I had to do it properly. A bouquet in cellophane, delivered by a proper florist with a card and everything. It would cost me, but if it did the trick, it would be worth every penny. At 6 o'clock that evening, the time I'd given the florist to deliver the flowers, everything went perfectly. Helen had just come in from work and was in the hall fiddling about with her hair. She'd been trying different hairstyles to see which would look better under the tiara. Mrs. Bayleaf had recommended, and I was sitting hidden at the top of the stairs watching. The doorbell rang and the flowers arrived. Helen gave a little shriek of excitement and, putting the flowers down on the hall table, ripped the card off the top. Now I'd been very clever here. Instead of putting a long excuse and explanation, and besides there wasn't one on the card, I'd just put forever M. This, I thought, was far more exciting and mysterious. It wouldn't take her long to figure out who M was, especially if gently reminded by me. So far, so good. I peered over the top and watched her face as she read the card. Forever M, I heard her mutter in a puzzled voice, and then her face cleared as if she'd realised, just as the doorbell rang and that man arrived. Now, I thought, now there would be ructions and rows. He'd be wildly jealous and she'd say it was just an old friend, and then he'd throw the flowers on the floor and stamp on them. And she'd say what a disgusting display of temper, and he was to leave the house immediately. But Helen threw her arms around his neck. "Darling," she said, "darling Mousy Wells." What?" he said. "Those flowers! Oh, Mouse, how romantic! You're just the darlingest mouse in the world. To go to a florist and send me flowers. I suppose you were too embarrassed to put from Mouse. Helen, He started again, but she was making silly, squeaky mouse noises in his ear. He tried once more, and then I saw him shrug slightly, as if he'd decided it didn't matter if she didn't believe him, and he might as well take the credit for them anyway. They went into the kitchen together, arms round each other, and both making silly, squeaky noises. I sat gloomily at the top of the stairs and thought about how much the flowers had cost, and wondered about rolling down the stairs and breaking a couple of legs, so they had to cancel the wedding. "Helen," I said, in a strange, squeaky voice down. "Helen," I said, in a strange, squeaky voice. Oh, sorry. Chapter 9. I'm not very good at heading my chapters today, sorry. Helen, I said in a strange, squeaky voice down the phone. No, there's no one of that name living here. Helen who? Helen Wilkins, the man said wearily. And I know it's you, Katie. Katie? Who's Katie? There's no... There's no one of that name living here, I said, pushing my big toe as far as possible through the hole in my trainers and ringing it. Please replace the receiver and try again. No, I will not replace the receiver, Katie, he suddenly said in a bossy schoolmastery voice. So please go and get Helen this instant. She's out, I said sulkily. Out? Out? Where out? I don't know, she said. She didn't tell me everything. A big car ride for her, and off she went with a stranger. Oops! I cried falsely. I wasn't supposed to say anything. Katie! Helen came down the stairs. Is that for me? What are you doing? Why didn't you call me? She snatched the phone, and I looked at her in pretended surprise. Oh, you're back! I didn't realise. Stupid, I'm never out. She hissed, then turned her back on me and said, Darling! Followed by some squeaky mouse noises. I pushed my big toe back in and went into the kitchen. Behind me I heard, No, I'm sure she's not all there lately. She does the strangest things. Makes stories. Yes, quite loopy. Perhaps it's her age. No, of course I wasn't like it, darling. In the kitchen, Mum was standing knee-deep in tissue paper and cardboard box. An enormous white three-tiered cake, the wedding cake, sat on the kitchen table. I ignored it. Anything to eat? I said. I'm starving to death. What do you think about this gorgeous creation? Mum said. I just had to assemble it to see what it looked like. Now, do you think this little bride and groom look best on top? She sat them on with a flourish, or she whisked them off and put on silver vase of dried flowers. The flower arrangement done by Mrs. Bailey. This flower arrangement done by Mrs. Bailey. The bride and groom, I said. Anything to eat? Mum gestured round the kitchen. Find yourself something, can you? Find yourself something, can you? I looked around. The worktops were covered thickly with little pastry objects, round things, triangular puffed things, sausage rolls and bits on sticks. On the window sat a vast turkey. On the washing machine was a joint of meat about as big as an elephant, and on the fridge was what looked like a small whale. I approached the small whale and taking a knife from the kitchen drawer, started hacking a piece off. Mum gave a horrified scream. The salmon! Don't touch my beautiful poached salmon! It's going next door to Mrs. Rogers' things. She turned back to the wedding cake. I'm not perfectly happy with the bride and groom, she said to herself, The bride had such a funny expression on her face. I wonder if the flower arrangement. I'll have these then. I'll have these then, I said, getting a plate and help to half a dozen little pastry things. Not the vol-au-vents! She cried in anguish, seeming to have eyes in the back of her head. There are only 100 prawn ones. I'll just starve then, shall I? Do you think this little bride is cross-eyed? Mum asked thoughtfully. And isn't her mouth a bit twisted? I stood near the turkey and, pretending to be fascinated by the drama being played out on the wedding cake, managed to pull off a lump of crispy skin and a chunk of flesh. This was what it had come to. I was reduced to foraging for food in my own house. Things were impossible. Everything moved around the wedding. Things were delivered at all hours. Vicars called. Mrs. Bailey loomed out of the night with boxes, brochures out of boxes. After the night with boxes, brochures were but people were continually on the phone saying, but we must have it for Saturday. It's absolutely imperative that we have it then. If I moved out, I didn't think anyone would notice. Apart from being pleased to have the extra space. Earlier that day, a present had arrived in the van from Felicity. To the happy couple from your bridesmaid, it said, and when it was unwrapped from its box of wood shavings, it turned out to be a thin crystal vase, the most beautiful vase anyone had ever seen. Such taste, such delicacy. How terribly thoughtful of someone so young. They looked at me as if to say, what have you bought? And I just looked at them blankly. It was bad enough being a bridesmaid, suffering the ordeal of going through all this and ending up with that man for a brother-in-law, without having it costing me money for a present as well. I think it's stupid, I said, glowering at the most wonderful vase in the world. It won't hold hardly anything, and it's too thin. It'll get smashed the first time you use it. I tried to ping it with a fingernail, but Helen had snatched it away, murmuring that she was glad that some people were aware of the great honour given to them by being asked to be a bridesmaid, and it was a most generous and thoughtful present for an absolutely lovely little girl. I pulled off another bit of turkey flesh and stuffed it into my mouth. I didn't feel as if I'd had a proper meal for weeks now. I was probably losing weight at a dreadful rate, and the powder blue dress would hang off me miles too big, and I'd more than likely faint of hunger in the church. I might faint in the church, I said to Mum. In fact, I feel pretty faint now, through lack of care and attention. I'm probably going to be very ill. Nonsense, Mum said. You look the picture of health. Well, it's no thanks to you, I said. I'm surprised you remember you've got another daughter. I think, on the whole, the flower arrangement, Mum said, putting it back on. There, Mrs. Bailey will be pleased. Helen came through to the kitchen, wearing the soppy look she always wore when she'd been speaking to that man. Oh, I much prefer the little bride and groom, she said. And I groaned to myself, tore off another lump of turkey, and made my way out. Entering the sitting room briefly, I passed by the wedding present display, pinged the crystal vase loudly, and dropped a small piece of greasy turkey skin on the card, saying, to the happy couple from your bridesmaid. Halfway up the stairs, I heard Mum scream, my turkey! The cat's been at it! But I carried onto my room regardless. All was lost. There was no way I could stop the wedding now. I just wished I could hibernate and wake up when it was all over. Chapter 10. That was Helen's last night in the house. That was Helen's last night in the house, Mum said tearfully on the wedding morning. Except for after the divorce, I said, but very quietly, because I wasn't much in favour. Mum poured herself out a cup of tea and started drinking it while getting things out of the fridge, ticking things off her list, picking her hair back, washing up saucepans and counting glasses. She consulted the list and turned her attention to me. Now, Felicity will be dropped off here soon. You two needn't start getting dressed for a couple of hours yet. When Dad gets back from the off licence, he'll take you to get the flowers, and then somebody will come up to your room and help you get ready. I can get myself ready. You heard what I said, Mum said warningly. You do exactly what I say today, and don't you dare go near that cake. I wasn't going to, I said moodily. And it wasn't my fault if a piece of icing came off in my hand. Your hand shouldn't have been near it. It wouldn't have been if I'd been fed, I muttered. And anyway, my bedroom's not big enough for me and Felicity and someone who's going to help us. Why can't I just get ready on my own? Felicity can go somewhere else. No, she can't, Mum said. She looked at the list thoughtfully. Mind you, your bedroom is small. But Auntie Muriel and Uncle Brian will be in mine. I always have the smallest everything, I said hopefully. Not for much longer, Mum said. You can move into Helen's room next week. Dad's already said he'll decorate it for you. I looked round at her in surprise. Really? Of course. There's no sense in it staying empty. Great, I said. Helen's room was much nicer. Not only was it bigger, with fitted wardrobes, with mirrors on them, but it also had loads of shelves and, best of all, a sink of its own. A sink of its own. In spite of everything, I began to feel very slightly cheerful. Mum looked at her watch. Now, Helen should be back from the hairdresser's any minute, and then I've got my appointment. If Felicity arrives while I'm out, I'm sure you'll look after her, won't you? Oh, yes, I said eagerly. I'll do that all right. Mum disappeared under a mass of fruit tartlets. Ooh, yum, I love fruit tarts. And a moment later, Helen arrived back from the hairdresser's with two friends, wearing about 6 cans of hairspray between them. They pushed past me, giggling their way up the stairs to Helen's room, and Helen came out and handed me a tiny box. Katie, your present for being a lovely bridesmaid, which I'm sure you will be if you put your mind to it. He said, oh, you shouldn't have. I said cheerfully, you shouldn't have. I said truthfully, not really wanting a silver locket and chain which would make my neck go black. Little Felicity will be here soon. Perhaps you'll give her this other box, she said, and then she disappeared back to a chorus of screeches from within. I opened the box. I looked in my box, though Mum had already told me what I'd got, and then I looked in Felicity's box to make sure she hadn't got anything better. I was reluctantly wondering whether I ought to have a bath before everyone arrived. Then when Mum shouted from downstairs that she wanted me, I went down and she led me into the sitting room where there was a large cardboard box. I don't think you deserve this, actually, she said. But Christopher insisted you should be given it. What? What? The cardboard box? Look in it, she said. I looked. It was a DVD player, black and silver, very modern. It's Christopher's old one. He brought it round for you last night. He and Helen will have her DVD player in her flat, and then they won't want two. Christopher said to tell you it's a proper bridesmaid's present from him. Oh, wow! I said, almost lost to speech and feeling really quite cheerful altogether. I'd wanted a DVD player for ages. Yes, I should jolly well think it is. Wow, said Mum. And I hope you'll be a lot nicer to him from now on. I will, I said fervently. Maybe I'd underestimated him. Maybe he was going to be okay. Maybe I'd be able to forgive the horrible shirts and old-fashioned trousers. Well, anyone who gave away DVD players had to be all right, really. I suppose the really most surprising thing that day was Felicity. She was dropped off by her mum at about 11 o'clock with all her stuff, and we stood on the doorstep staring at each other. Her blonde curls were scraped back in a ponytail, and she was wearing a tracksuit which could have been the twin of mine, except that it was pale green, or had been once. Straight away, I knew that she wasn't going to be goody bridesmaid of the year, and started to feel very cheerful indeed. Hello, Felicity, I said. Are you coming in? I hate the name Felicity. She says it's so twee. You can call me Flicker if you like. She followed me in, carrying her wrapped up bridesmaid's dress and a load of other bits, and we went upstairs, past the present display in the sitting room. She pulled a face at her vase and said, Isn't it gross? Mum made me buy it. Absolutely gross, I agreed, and we grinned at each other. We went upstairs. Helen came out with a blue garter on her leg to say hello, and then we went into my room and plonked down on the bed. Guess what? Flicker said. Dad and I called in to wish Christopher luck, and honestly, you should see what my Auntie Beattie Bailey is wearing. I nearly had hysterics on the spot. What's it like? I asked eagerly. Well, apparently it's the hit of the year in continental cruise wear. Some sort of vast pink tent made out of nylon fluffy stuff. She looks like an elephant in candy floss. Gross. Gross. We rolled onto my bed, giggling, and then realised we were rolling on Flicker's bridesmaid's dress and hastily hung it up. There was one other small surprise to come. Very small. I hope you haven't rolled on Mickey, Flicker said anxiously, pulling out a small white handbag from under her. Who's Mickey? I asked. A mouse, she said apologetically. I know it's a corny name, but my little sister wanted him to be called that. She dug into her bag and pulled him out, and he sat on her hand and looked at us, twitching his whiskers. He's lovely, I said. But what's he coming to the wedding for? Well, because I couldn't leave him at home, she said. And because, well, Auntie Beattie Bailey hates mice. Didn't you know? I shook my head. I thought maybe if it gets boring later on, you know, she said thoughtfully. I grinned at her. I think it might, I said, and I also thought to myself that I might have been wrong all along about weddings. And that's the end of the story. Katie was a bit of a wally sometimes, I think, but I think she's right. I think she was she'd jumped to conclusions a little bit, shall we say. What do you think, Cariad? Do you think Katie will be cheered up now that she's found a new friend and she's got a lovely new DVD player from her brother-in-law? Yeah? I think so too. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching and subscribing and commenting. It really makes my day when you do. And I'll see you soon for another video. Can you wave, Cariad? Good girl. Cheerio, everybody.